What do you think at the moment is most wrong in British society?
Well, I think the most crucial thing I try to get people to understand, and not to be melodramatic about it, is that Britain is a post-revolutionary society. The revolution has already happened, and revolutions don't require mobs in the streets and red flags flying from rooftops. We've had a quiet revolution that's taken place over the course of decades, and it's led to the capture of all our institutions. And in a sense, we've been ideologically subverted as a nation. So the institutions of this country, from the civil service to all of our museums and galleries, to our legacy media, to our academia, to the parliament itself, they look the same. But the people who inhabit those institutions are cuckoos in the nest. They bear no comparison to the generations who actually build and run those institutions. And of course, it's institutions that set the tone for the culture of the nation. It's institutions that essentially mold minds. And what this is called, people may be familiar with this term, the long march through the institutions, and that's what it is. There's been a long, slow, gradual, almost imperceptible march through institutions, which gathered speed under Tony Blair, but it actually goes back long before Tony Blair. And a lot of people tend to just view this as, oh, this is all about Tony Blair. And I know a lot of people now are talking about a great repeal bill. All we need to do is just reverse all of Tony Blair's terrible legislation and we'll be back to some sort of normality. I'm afraid the problem is much deeper than that, because I'm sure most people understand now this is a global phenomenon. It's a Western phenomenon, I should say, very much a Western phenomenon, especially an Anglosphere phenomenon. And that's also quite important because this emanates from ultimately this culture, which some people call woke. I call it American Marxism. I think woke is too much of a soft and cuddly term, emanated from America. And so you often hear people say, well, woke is a mind virus. It's true, but it's a mind virus transmitted through the English language. And of course, where is woke strongest? In the Anglosphere, then in Scandinavia and in the Netherlands, where of course English is as well spoken as English is. And the less countries speak English, the lower the degree to which you find left infiltration with these new ideologies of the new left, or woke, or the progressive left. Now, how did we get to this position where, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, here, it seems as if the culture's gone completely topsy-turvy. We've seen gender ideology and critical race theory, post-colonial theory, decolonization, statues being pulled down, mass migration, Black Lives Matter. How did all of this come to be? Well, not to give too long of a history lesson, after the Russian Revolution, communists in Europe were puzzled and really distressed because they always assumed that the communist revolution would happen in the industrialized West. And where did it happen? It happened in agrarian cultures. It happened in feudal cultures in China and in Russia. And they realized that the foot soldiers of the revolution, those that were supposed to carry on the revolution, the proletariat, were actually small c conservative patriots, much like, of course, we found with the Red Wall voters who deserted the Labour Party and went over firstly to Boris Johnson and voted for Brexit because they also are small c conservatives. And suddenly they realized that although classical Marxism was all about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the oppressor and the oppressed, and the need to seize the means of industrial production to get control of the factories and all that, they realized that wasn't going to work in the West. The economics wasn't going to be the way to do it. They needed to change the mentality of the proletariat. They needed to seize the means of cultural production. So they needed to control all the things that make people patriotic. So the schools, the colleges, the newspapers, everything that essentially sets the zeitgeist for a nation. And so there was the chap who put this forward as a person called Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist, and he developed this idea. And at the same time, you had in Frankfurt, in Germany, the rise of the Frankfurt School, which was deliberately looking at how we can actually have a communist revolution of sorts by using culture. Herbert Marcuse was one of the names some of your viewers may be familiar with. Then after the Second World War, people from the Frankfurt School went to America. No point living in Germany immediately post-war, and they went into the universities, particularly places like Berkeley in California and so forth. And suddenly these radical ideas began to permeate through American academia. And of course, by the time you got to, say, 1968, you saw the effects of this when you saw, of course, the students rioting and you saw so much unrest being fomented. The idea was working. And it was at this time that you began to get the rise of these radical extremist left-wing elements, things like the New Left. And these chaps wanted to have a revolution overnight. They wanted essentially to have bombs in the streets and civil unrest. And there was a chap called Rudi Deutschke who said, hang on, chaps, this is 1960s America. It's still very, very conservative, very patriotic. I mean, Americans love their country. We can't change their minds overnight. We need to have a long march through the institutions. We need to train a generation of students, indoctrinate them with these ideas, and they will then go into all of the other institutions as qualified teachers, professors, civil servants, government ministers, and so forth. That's how we do it. And he says we can't rely on the working man, because the working man is essentially still patriotic. We need to actually look at minorities, and minorities are going to be the foot soldiers of the revolution rather than the working class. So you're going to look at women, look at ethnic minorities, look at homosexuals and lesbians, look at trans and so forth. Basically, use the minorities and try to foment the discord and demoralization and destabilization through that. And as one political scientist put it very well, when he said, everyone thinks about Marxism as being this traditional economic Marxism of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but actually it's one of several species of Marxism. If you think of it like a cat is a genus of Marxism, but then you have leopards, tigers, tabby cats, jaguars. So traditional economic Marxism was the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, but then you got radical feminism, and that was an attack on masculinity and the qualities of maleness that, of course, made Western civilization so great. Then you got then you got gender queer theory, and queer theory was all about also attacking the family and masculinity. Then you also got things like critical race theory, which is again about attacking whiteness. And so these were all ways in which you were attacking the fundamental pillars that were the foundation of the success of Western civilization. And I find that analogy quite effective. And that's what we've seen. By the 1980s, of course, these people were being churned out of these universities, and that's what we've seen. The 80s, the 90s, slowly, first in academia, elsewhere, we've seen this institutional capture. And what happened was, in the 1970s, there were organizations like Prairie Fire in America who put out pamphlets talking about things like white privilege, systemic racism. And these were such radical ideas. These pamphlets only circulated to around 100 people. They were things only spoken about in conspiratorial underground basements and so forth. Now those radical Marxist ideas of critical race theory and so forth, decolonization, that's become part of mainstream academic life. And people who are perpetuating it aren't Marxists. I'm not saying this is a Marxist conspiracy, but at its root they're Marxists. But the Overton window has shifted so much that you have well-meaning liberals, part of the Be Kind Brigade, who just think they're being nice, and they're actually promoting radical far-left Marxism. And at the golden core of it is an attempt to undermine Britain, America, and the West, and essentially to demoralize and destabilize the society, to disconnect us from any pride in who we are as a people, and by so doing, in essence, to introduce new myths and a new ideology, that diversity built Britain, for example, and essentially create a new society.
And to what end? So obviously, I find your explanation incredibly coherent and persuasive, but obviously those who did that, I don't think had what they would consider to be nefarious or sinister reasons for doing it. They think they're improving the world and humanity. And indeed, many of them would probably say this is just actually the evolution of progression, hence the idea that they call themselves progressives. So what is their aim for having put in place this kind of coordinated capture of our institutions?
Well, as I say, at its root cause, the originators of all of this were Marxists. So it's undeniable that this came out of the Frankfurt School and it came to America, took root there. That's why it's called American Marxism. So the ideas that were permeated, the genus of the whole thing, the roots of the family tree are Marxist. But the people purveying it today simply aren't aware that they are putting forward Marxist ideas. They want to be kind. So they believe, of course, in that, racism is one of the key issues facing this country. Whereas we know from all the evidence, Britain is one of the top 3 least racist countries. Brazil, Sweden, and Britain are the world's 3 least racist nations. But so indoctrinated have our youth been, for example, that they think racism is the number 1 issue facing this country, ahead even of, for them, Brexit and climate change and so forth like that. So it's part of this idea now that this constant belief that women are oppressed, this constant belief that that being the black or an ethnic minority in this country is a huge disadvantage, despite, of course, white working class boys being the most disadvantaged. So in an effort to be kind, people are promoting these ideologies, not understanding actually that they're promoting radical Marxist ideology. And the purpose of that Marxist ideology was to create a communist revolution, to overthrow and undermine our institutions and structures from the monarchy down.